The cameras captured her glow, but never her silence. Every flashbulb froze her in an eternal moment, a glance, a tilt of the chin, a cascade of hair brushing against skin so luminous it seemed sculpted by light. She was radiant, untouchable, a creature born not of flesh but of magazine gloss. And yet, between those flashes, when the lights dimmed and the stylists packed away their brushes, she would return to something the world refused to see, a silence so deep it could swallow her whole. Her name was Gia Carangi. And for a brief, burning moment in the late 1970s, she was more than just a model. She was the storm before the calm, the blueprint for a word the fashion world hadn't yet coined, supermodel. Before Cindy, before Naomi, before Christy, there was Gia. A young woman who didn't just wear clothes, but transformed them, bending the entire weight of culture around her presence. But Gia's story is not the kind you tell with a smile. It is not the kind of story where the applause drowns out the tragedy. Hers is the kind of story whispered, almost in shame, by an industry that profited from her body but never understood her soul. It is the story of a girl lifted to unimaginable heights, only to be abandoned when the machinery of beauty no longer found her useful. To understand Gia is to understand the cruel paradox of fashion. Fashion adores rebellion, but it does not protect rebels. It fetishizes the outsider, but offers no safe place for them to land. And Gia, with her boyish swagger, her raw sensuality, her refusal to conform to the polished femininity of the 1970s, became its perfect contradiction. She was everything fashion wanted to exploit, and everything it could not contain. Even now, when you flip through the pages of those old Vogues, when you see her eyes peering out with that combination of softness and defiance, you feel it, the haunting knowledge that this was a young woman burning from both ends. A beauty too honest, too wounded, too alive for the polished lie of the industry she inhabited. The spotlight adored her. But the spotlight is a cruel lover. It offers warmth for a moment, then turns its gaze elsewhere, leaving only shadows behind. Think of New York, 1978. The city was humming with excess. Studio 54 pulsed with disco beats, cocaine lined the bathroom mirrors, and fashion was hungry for a new face, someone who could embody both danger and desire. Gia walked into that moment like fate had been waiting. She was not just another model, she was a mirror of the times. Restless. Reckless. Too fragile to survive, yet too powerful to ignore. And yet, beneath the glitter and the chaos, there was always the silence. The silence of a girl who grew up in a broken home, who learned abandonment too early, who carried wounds no makeup brush could ever conceal. Every pose, every photograph, every chain-link fence she leaned against in front of a camera was both a performance and a confession. She was telling the world, without words, look at me. Do not look away. See me, before I disappear. Gia Carangi's story is not just about beauty. It is not just about addiction. It is not just about AIDS, or the cruel way her life ended before it had fully begun. It is about the quiet truth that beauty, when worshipped too violently, becomes its own kind of curse. She was 26 when she died. 26, an age when most people are just beginning to sketch out the outlines of their lives. But by then, Gia had already lived a lifetime of glory and ruin. She had already become a legend and a cautionary tale. And so this story, her story, begins where most stories end. With the recognition that we are not watching a triumph, but a tragedy unfolding in plain sight. A tragedy dressed in Armani silk and Versace leather, hidden behind the high-gloss smile of fashion spreads. The cameras captured her glow. They caught the curve of her jaw, the defiance in her eyes, the way she could turn vulnerability into something electric. But the cameras never captured the silence. The silence of hotel rooms after midnight. The silence of needles and broken promises. The silence of a girl who wanted love but was handed only desire. This is not just a biography. It is a confession, an elegy, a requiem for a young woman who gave the world her beauty and was repaid with abandonment. The lights adored her. But in the end, only the shadows remained. Before there were cameras. Before the velvet ropes of Studio 54. Before the pages of Vogue turned her into a myth, there was a little girl in Philadelphia, watching the walls of her house collapse around her. Gia Carangi was born in January of 1960. The world she entered was not a gentle one. Her father owned a small restaurant, his days long and weary, his nights often swallowed by work. Her mother, beautiful and restless, seemed built for something else, always halfway out the door, her affection fleeting, her presence unpredictable. The house was not a home. It was a place of arguments, of slammed doors, of voices raised not in lullabies but in anger. And when Gia was 11 years old, her mother left for good. Imagine being that young, and discovering that love, the very first love you are supposed to know, can abandon you without looking back. That lesson carved itself into Gia like a wound that never closed. She carried that wound everywhere. At school, she was shy, quiet, sometimes withdrawn. But there was always a hunger in her eyes, as if she were searching for a place that felt safe, a person who might not leave. She adored her brothers, clung to friends, and yet beneath it all was the certainty that she was different, and that difference isolated her even before the world learned her name. In Philadelphia, the streets whispered promises of escape. The mid-70s were alive with music, rebellion, and a shifting language of identity. The city was gritty, bruised, yet pulsing with subcultures that refused to die quietly. For a girl like Gia, tender, volatile, and already aching for more, it was both dangerous and magnetic. She discovered early what it meant to exist in two realities at once. At home, the fractured family and the loneliness. Outside, the chance to invent herself anew. And Gia was a master of invention. Friends from her teenage years remembered how she gravitated toward the outsiders, the misfits, the ones who smoked in the shadows and dressed in ways that blurred the lines of boy and girl. She wasn't the type to sit quietly in a corner, nor was she desperate to conform. She was restless, electric, a girl whose eyes always seemed fixed on something the rest of them couldn't see. When her mother left, something hardened in Gia. But something else, something luminous, also took shape. She built herself from fragments, a boy's shirt, a cigarette held a little too tightly between two fingers, a stare that dared you to underestimate her. She became both the wound and the weapon. It is tempting, in retrospect, to look at these early years and read them like prophecy. To say, of course she was destined for fashion. Of course she was meant for that otherworldly stage. But destiny is too simple a word for Gia. What happened was not fate. It was escape. Modeling was never just about beauty for her. It was about running from something, the hollow spaces of her childhood, the silence left by her mother, the feeling of being unseen. She wanted to be visible, undeniable, impossible to forget. She wanted a world that could not abandon her. And so the roots of Gia's rise were not woven in glamour or ambition. They were planted in loss. In a young girl sitting on the edge of a bed in Philadelphia, staring at the door her mother had closed behind her. In the echo of footsteps that never returned. The tragedy of Gia Carangi is that the very thing that broke her also built her. That wound, the abandonment, the loneliness, gave her the raw intensity that would later mesmerize cameras, designers, entire audiences. It was the secret ingredient, the unspoken truth behind her gaze. When she looked into a lens, you didn't just see a pretty face. You saw longing. You saw defiance. You saw the child who had been left behind, demanding that this time, someone would stay. But Philadelphia never let go. The city remained in her bones, its grit, its restlessness, its capacity for both violence and resilience. And Gia, even at 17, carried all of it like a second skin. This is where the story truly begins. Not on the catwalk. Not in the glossy magazines. But in a fractured home, in a lonely girl's heart, in the hollow silence of Philadelphia nights. Gia was not made by the fashion industry. She was forged long before it found her, forged in abandonment, tempered in pain, polished not by glamour but by grief. And when she finally stepped in front of the camera, when the flashbulbs first began to adore her, the world thought it saw a star being born. What it was really seeing was a wound learning how to shine. There are certain moments in youth when the world seems to crack open, when ordinary nights become portals to something stranger, brighter, more alive. For Gia, that doorway was lit in neon and cigarette smoke. It was the mid-1970s, and Philadelphia was humming with its own underground pulse, clubs filled with music that throbbed like a heartbeat, kids painting their faces in glitter, boys in lipstick, girls in tailored jackets, all of them chasing the freedom David Bowie had promised. They called themselves the Bowie Kids. A tribe of dreamers and misfits who refused to be defined by the narrow boxes of gender, fashion, or expectation. They lived in the shadow of glam rock, inventing new identities each night, creatures of eyeliner and sequins, warriors of androgyny. And in the middle of this glowing chaos was Gia. She was still just a teenager then, a girl trying to outrun the silence of her home. But inside these clubs, she was no longer the quiet daughter from Philadelphia. She became something else entirely. Her hair cropped short, her frame wrapped in men's shirts and distressed denim, her eyes outlined in black, she moved through the smoke-filled rooms with a kind of raw magnetism. She was not trying to look pretty. She was not trying to look feminine. She was trying to look free. And people noticed. Not because she was the most polished. Not because she was the most extravagant. But because she was real. While others performed their rebellion like theater, Gia embodied it without effort. She blurred the line between girl and boy, soft and hard, desire and defiance. She was both, and neither. A living contradiction, and it made her unforgettable. There's a photograph, years later, that captures this essence. Not a professional shoot, not a magazine cover, just Gia leaning in a corner, cigarette between her fingers, eyes steady and unflinching. It tells you everything, the toughness, the vulnerability, the sense that she had already seen too much and wanted even more. That image wasn't created by fashion. It was born in these nights, in these clubs, in the tribe of Bowie kids who showed her that identity could be armor. The 1970s were not kind to those who didn't fit the mold. The culture admired difference when it was packaged, sold, or draped across a stage, but on the streets, and in the lives of real young people, difference was dangerous. Gia walked that razor's edge every night. To be openly androgynous, to desire women as openly as she did, was to invite stares, whispers, sometimes worse. But Gia never flinched. She carried her queerness, her defiance, not as a secret but as a flag. And in that, she was decades ahead of her time. The irony, of course, is that what made her an outsider in Philadelphia was the very thing that would one day make her invaluable to the fashion world. Designers and photographers were searching for new faces, for a kind of beauty that felt dangerous and untamed. And Gia, even as a teenager, was already sculpting that language. Without realizing it, she was rehearsing for a stage much larger than the smoky clubs of her hometown. But none of this felt like destiny then. For Gia, these nights were not preparation, they were survival. They were escape. In the dim glow of neon lights, surrounded by other kids who blurred the same lines, she could finally breathe. She could exist without apology. She could be seen without being abandoned. Imagine her there, 17 years old, music vibrating through her bones, cigarette smoke curling in the air, watching herself reflected in the eyes of strangers who didn't question what she was, only that she was. In that reflection, Gia found something she had been craving her whole life, recognition. It wasn't yet fame. It wasn't yet immortality. It was simply being seen. And for a girl who had been left behind, that was everything. Years later, when the cameras captured her for Vogue, when her face hung in store windows across the world, critics would talk about her rawness, her toughness, her edge. They would marvel at her androgyny, her defiance of convention. What they never understood was that Gia hadn't invented that for fashion. She had invented it for survival, in Philadelphia, as a Bowie kid in the half-light of nightclubs. This is where the legend truly began, not on the runway, not in the pages of a glossy magazine, but in a teenage girl's refusal to be boxed in, silenced, or erased. She was not yet Gia, the supermodel. She was Gia, the misfit. Gia, the rebel. Gia, the girl who blurred the lines until they dissolved, leaving only herself, undeniable, unforgettable, unstoppable. And it was only a matter of time before the wider world came looking. It happened the way myths often begin, not in the brightness of day, but in the haze of a nightclub. The room was dark, alive with music, bodies moving in waves, smoke twisting through colored lights. In the middle of it all was Gia. 17 years old. A girl who had already learned how to armor herself in androgyny, who leaned against the night like she owned it. She wasn't posing for anyone. She wasn't asking to be found. And yet, she was impossible to ignore. A local photographer spotted her first. Noticed the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, gaze steady, lips parted as if she were about to say something too dangerous to be spoken. In a room of kids trying to look like someone else, Gia looked only like herself. The camera, even before it touched her, was already falling in love. One introduction led to another. Soon she was standing in front of a lens for the first time, untrained, unpolished, but instinctive. She didn't smile unless she felt like it. She didn't pose the way other girls did. She leaned, slouched, stared, and somehow every gesture became art. She was raw energy distilled into an image. Those first photographs spread like whispers. And whispers have a way of finding ears that matter. Within months, Gia was in New York. She walked through the glass doors of Wilhelmina Models, an agency that had shaped the careers of legends. And there, at the heart of it, was Wilhelmina Cooper herself, once a model.